Susan, I am so happy to talk to you because I have been reading your work and the work of so many other great journalists, and I am very, very disturbed about the turn of events and what is happening in terms of our sudden switch and reshuffling of what was really the world order since World War II. And why don't you start by explaining what candidate Trump said about Russia just a little over a week again. And then, of course, we had many events which we'll talk about. The delay in Ukraine funding, we had the murder of Alexei Navalny, and many other things to talk about. But tell me, I know you covered him, and I will get to my question for a long time, Susan. In the grand scheme of things, how disturbing is this latest turn of events for you?
Yeah, thank you so much, Katie. I love to be with you and your awesome community. You have so many passionate followers. I don't think they care whether we know how to use the camera on this Instagram app or not. They love you, and so do I. This is a really scary moment. President Biden, he often talks about an inflection point. Maybe people's eyes roll or not. I don't know. But I will tell you, having paid attention to Russia over the last 2 decades, as Putin has not only consolidated power inside Russia, but, used that authority to crack down inside the country and outside and to launch this war of aggression on Ukraine. What he's been banking on is now seemingly coming to pass, which is the weakness of the West itself in seeking to stand against him. And it's our own internal divisions. I've thought this for a while now, really ever since the beginning of the Trump years, but that America's internal divisions, in a way, have become the greatest geopolitical instability in the world. And so when you see the kind of, the fissures become so apparent as they did over the last week, the system shrieking, that the earthquake being felt. The earthquake is our own politics, the failure to purge Trump to be the world's biggest power, but to be uncomfortable in playing that role anymore. And so I think that that's the big picture context for Donald Trump saying what I know sounds shocking to many people, even if it's not surprising to me and those of us who've listened for a long time, saying to our NATO allies in Europe, which is what he said at his campaign rally a little bit more than a week ago, well, if you don't pay up, meaning whatever amount he thinks is appropriate for your defense budget, NATO, then let Russia come in and do whatever the hell it wants. And as scary to me as Donald Trump saying that, he's been anti-NATO and complaining about our allies for years. I went back and listened to the video numerous times. What really chilled me and scared me was the response of the audience to what should be a horrific gaffe by any American politician. They clapped and they cheered. And it's this clapping and cheering by, say, 30 to even up to 40% of our society or our voting population that has given Trump the fuel and the energy to keep going for 8 years now.
Well, let's talk about why MAGA followers are so willing to basically lift up Russia, Vladimir Putin, a ruthless dictator, and we can talk about Navalny's death in a moment. I understand sort of anti-globalization, right? I understand even more of an isolationist tendency following Iraq and Afghanistan and other foreign entanglements. What I don't understand is why they would embrace Russia and Putin in particular with such, zealousness.
Yeah, that is in many ways the big, $34,000 question. I guess with inflation, we should probably get that to be a bigger number. But a couple thoughts on that. Number one, there's Donald Trump personally, as opposed to his followers. They may be somewhat different reasons. Trump clearly has a kind of built-in, almost congenital admiration for strong men. Strong, it, by the way, is like the biggest compliment in his very limited vocabulary. When he was president, he admired not only Vladimir Putin, but China's Xi Jinping. He complimented President Erdogan in Turkey for his various crackdowns on democracy democracy inside Turkey. He once met the military leader of Egypt, President Sisi, and welcomed him with the cry, "Ah, my favorite dictator." And of course, he exchanged the famous love letters with Kim Jong-un. So Donald Trump has a very well documented and very pronounced, and of course, very unpresidential, if you're an American, admiration for the world's dictators, thugs, and strongmen. That's number one. Number two, historically, interestingly enough, there is this strand that goes actually way back in the Republican Party and in our history. And I would recommend to your listeners a couple of recent books that I think put that in sharp relief for me in a way that I hadn't thought about before, because we kind of associate the Republican Party with Ronald Reagan and
Right.
his rhetoric about freedom and the evil empire that he was opposing in the Soviet Union. But there's a different strand of Republicanism and the Republican Party going more than a century back. My friend Jacob Heilbrunn has a new book out today that I found amazing. It's called America Last, and it's the long history of the Republican Party's flirtation with foreign dictators. And then Rachel Maddow, actually, I know she's well known to everybody as the MSNBC host. She did a very interesting book of serious history that came out last year called Prequel, which is about a particular group of pro-Nazi Germany, American homegrown fascists, and what happened to them during World War II in the United States. So I'd recommend both those books to people as they're trying to wrestle with this question of, where does this come from in our society? The difference, of course, is that now Donald Trump has hijacked one of our two political parties and is the leader of it and could become president again. That we never had happen before. We had Republicans who admired maybe individual dictators, but we never had a leader of one of our two political parties who
Let's
did.
talk about the ramifications of this kind of realignment, not only this kind of rhetoric, but potentially this kind of realignment in terms of what it means globally. I know that's a massive question, Susan, but can you kind of tease that out a little bit? Because I'm worried that people are not taking this seriously enough.
Yeah, I think that it's hard. I understand that, for many Americans, this kind of geopolitics has always felt far away, and that's our great luxury as a society. And that's why, unfortunately, you're hearing a lot from people who follow international politics right now about the 1930s, which is also a time when Americans felt that, the sort of squabbles and petty politics, even if they were distasteful of European dictators, didn't have too much to do with what was happening here in the United States, protected by our two great oceans. We live in a much more interconnected world, by the way, even than the one that we lived in the 1930s. And it's just not possible to put your head in the sand, number one. Number two, we, unlike in the 1930s, America is actually the guarantor of this liberal international order and has been ever since the end of World War II, and especially since the end of the Cold War. There is no meaningful European security without the participation of the United States. That's the bottom line. That's the truth. It's possible to conceive of a future where there is. But right now, let me tell you, when Europeans are freaking out because they understand that Putin, if he wins in Ukraine, isn't likely to stop there is no meaningful plan B. People talk about, oh, well, Macron wants to start a European security force. Don't believe it. As of right now, European security is guaranteed, funded, supported, sustained by the United States of America, and there is no plan B. And I just think it's hard for people maybe to really realize how much that is the case. And if we don't have that, if we turn our heads away, catastrophe is very, very likely to follow.
So play that out. What does that mean, catastrophe? Because right now, well, actually, why don't we dig down for a second on Ukraine? Aid to Ukraine has been delayed by 2 weeks by the Speaker of the House. I'm not quite sure why. I guess maybe some of these forces are coming to play when it comes to House Republicans. But how dire is the situation in Ukraine, Susan, and how needed is this aid? Give us a quick update on what's happening there, because it's kind of being left out of the news cycle at this point.
Yeah, so Katie, first of all, there's a simple reason why Mike Johnson hasn't brought the aid to Ukraine to the floor, and it's two words: Donald Trump. And, this is a really kind of painful example of where the politics and preferences of one man are dictating outcomes both for a party and for a whole country. And Trump has essentially ordered Johnson, who would not be speaker without Trump's support, to stop this from coming to a vote on the floor because it would be very likely to pass. Joe Biden asked Congress months ago, back in October, to pass a national security supplemental bill with aid not only for Ukraine, but also for Israel and Taiwan. He's asked for about $60 billion in additional assistance to Ukraine. That was back in October. Well, now the existing authorities and money that the Pentagon had stored up for Ukraine have run out, according to the Pentagon. And that is being felt on the ground, according to Ukrainian military officials who are rationing ammunition because the ammunition and support they were promised from the United States has not been delivered. And in a practical sense, remember that Ukraine, it's the 2-year anniversary of Putin's full-scale invasion of Ukraine. They have been holding out and doing a remarkable job of fighting against a much larger country that has a much larger military with more weapons, more soldiers, and more soldiers that they can call upon in their society. And they just over the weekend had to withdraw from the town of Avdiivka in the east of Ukraine. That's the most significant gain of territory for Russians really since the early months of the war. And there could be more like that. Russia is right now pressing along a 600-mile front, is pressing an offensive.
And they desperately need this aid. But do Republicans, I mean, is Donald Trump a stronger voice in their heads than the need to have Ukraine not being taken over by Russia?
Short answer, yes.
Is that not crazy to you?
Yes, the whole thing is crazy to me. I mean, that's the thing. We are living in the last 8 years, right, in this situation where a minority, it's a large and significant minority, but a minority of the country has really departed in many ways from what you and I would consider, the previous norms of American politics. We've had sharp ideological fights before, polarization, but we haven't had essentially a kind of right-wing populist demagogue take over a party, impose his own personal quirky agenda, change even the basic policy platforms of that party, and people are still fanatic to follow him. It's something different in American politics, and that's part of why you'll often hear the lament. Well, Trump doesn't seem to have to follow the same rules as everybody else in American politics, and his followers seem to love that. They seem heedless of the consequences to the planet.
Let's talk just briefly about two more figures who weigh into this whole conversation, Susan. First, I think we should talk about Navalny because I don't know about you, but I think everyone was so stunned by his death. He appeared on videotape, looked to be thin but in good spirits the night before. Can you just give everyone listening, because I want to make sure we all are up to speed on this, and I highly recommend rewatching the documentary Navalny, but who Navalny was and why you believe this happened and how.
Yeah. No, Alexei Navalny is a remarkable figure. In some ways, I think he was one of the most successful political figures of the last decades in global politics. Essentially leveraged a brilliant skills for communication, for a kind of investigative reporting as activism using the new tools of social media and the internet, and turned that into a movement in Russia at a time when Vladimir Putin was starving the space for civil society and starving the ability for any kind of political dissent. You'll remember that he was poisoned by the Russian government in August of 2020. He nearly died. It was only thanks to the bravery and heroism of the people on the airplane that he was on. They landed, made an emergency landing. Doctors there kept him alive. His wife, Yulia, we've all seen her incredible bravery and courage. In the last few days, she managed to persuade the doctors on the ground to let them fly Alexei Navalny to Germany for treatment. And the result was that he almost was like a man risen from the dead the last few years, and yet he chose to spend this new lease on life to go back to Russia, knowing that he risked very likely imprisonment and even death. And so this is a kind of heroic figure that we don't often see, frankly, in modern politics. And I think the Kremlin was afraid of him. Why kill a man who's already in your custody unless you're very, very afraid?
But what about the timing? Was there, someone had told me, and by the way, this hasn't been confirmed or verified, so take it with a grain of salt, that there was a prisoner swap that seemed to be very close to happening. And I'm not sure if that's accurate, but I'm just curious why you think the timing was such.
Well, it's always hard to know, but I do think that one factor that may not have crossed people's minds here in the U.S. is that there is a presidential election coming up in less than 6 weeks inside Russia. Now, of course, it's not a real free and fair presidential election, and we know the outcome already, which is that Vladimir Putin will be reelected. But one thing that I learned from reporting inside Russia and spending a lot of time is that even in the Soviet times, even when the system was rigged, they care a lot about the formal niceties of maintaining a system. Even in the Soviet times, they had voting, they had elections. It mattered to them. It was about what they perceived the legitimacy of their regime to stand upon these kind of political formalities. So this election actually does matter to Vladimir Putin in that sense. And I also think that the message being sent is not one so much to us. I actually don't think that murdering Alexei Navalny in the Gulag is about what people were going to say at the Munich Security Conference. I think it's about what the Russian people were meant to understand. And what they're meant to understand is there is no hope, there is no democracy, there is only what I say. Look at the video of Vladimir Putin that was shown after Navalny's death was reported. He was positively ebullient. He is telling the Russian people very clearly, you have no democratic alternative. You are not allowed to protest. And they have used this in full-scale invasion of Ukraine as cover for a parallel massive crackdown on what remained of civil society inside Russia today. And I think this is the final, sort of bow on that moment in Russia.
And that's a great segue to what I want to address with you at the close of this conversation, Susan, is given that backdrop, Tucker Carlson's visit to Russia, praising Vladimir Putin, praising the Russian systems, praising life in Russia, comparing it to the US and saying it's basically far superior. I'm curious for your reaction to that. And is he feeding into this populist, pro-Russia, love affair with dictators that we're seeing from MAGA Central?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if the words that I think about that are allowed to be said on your Instagram feed, so I won't say it. But this is BS, folks. It is BS of the highest order. Russia is a unfree society with a disastrously low standard of living, despite the great wealth in the country, and that is because of the corruption and thieving of its leaders and their utter disdain for human life, not to mention their evisceration in a very systematic way over the last 2 decades of the basics of what we would consider human freedoms necessary to live in a modern society. And it is grotesque to see an American who claims to call himself a journalist, even though he's not, to allow himself to be used to further the propaganda of this murderous dictator. And there's no other way to put it. It is grotesque. It is appalling. And I hope that people don't fall for this propaganda, but unfortunately, we know that propaganda works. And, useful idiots from the West have long been deployed by Soviet and Russian leaders in order to plant a false story about their country to the world. But I can tell you, as somebody who lived there, at a time when Putin was just taking power and consolidating his authority, so there were still some freedoms left. Believe me, not all Russians were cheering at the idea that politics would be eliminated, that their freedoms to write and speak and communicate as they wish. People are being arrested today, Katie, for for the thought crime of uh, putting up a social media post, for the thought crime of placing a flower at a memorial stone to honor Alexei Navalny. Can you imagine if your son or daughter or grandmother or grandfather was hauled off to jail for placing a flower on someone's grave? That is an unfree country, and it is grotesque to see an American cheerleading for that.
And I'd like to also just mention for all the people who are bemoaning our choices for president of the United States, there is no moral equivalence here, Susan. I think we need to be clear about that in terms of who is the anti democracy candidate and who is the pro democracy candidate in this country.
Absolutely, Katie. I mean, we can certainly have our concerns or qualms about an incumbent president who would be 86 years old at the end of his second term in office, but he's not someone who, or any of those who would step in his absence. Joe Biden is a guarantor of American democracy, and Donald Trump is the only president in American history who has ever sought to overturn the results of a legitimate election. He is a constitutional nightmare who believes that people like Kim Jong Un and Vladimir Putin have it right. Trump is a natural authoritarian. Those are his instincts, and that is very explicitly the agenda that he would bring to a second term in the White
It's
House.
no surprise that he admires these people who you described as thugs and dictators and authoritarian figures because that is what he in fact aspires to be. I'm going to close by reading the end of your piece, your recent piece, Susan, in the New Yorker, which I so appreciated. And by the way, you can read Susan's Glasser's work in the New Yorker and follow her on social media where she posts her latest work. But you closed by saying a year ago it might have appeared unthinkable that so many Republicans would abandon Ukraine just because Trump urged them to do so. A year from now, there is the not implausible chance that when a reelected President Trump demands that they make concessions to Putin or pull back from commitments to our treaty allies in Europe, they will follow him in that too. And then in bold type, you say, consider yourself warned. Do you think people are paying attention to this, Susan?
I hope that they are, Katie. I really hope that they are, because the stakes of this election are pretty existential for not only our democracy, but for the whole world. And that's what I hear anytime I talk with anyone from Europe or Asia. They say, this is an election you Americans are having in which our lives and our fates are being determined as well.